I put it safe for kids. Maybe that was a mistake.
I think it's
Whoever
just
was
like,
gonna come for me.
yeah, I think it just changes what like ads they play or something like that. But I figured just always click no, just in case.
Sure, that's fair.
Yeah. Okay. Who wants to start?
I'll go first. It's fine.
Okay.
All
Cool.
right. Let me see here.
And the stream's going, so we're good to go.
All right. Cool. Did I do this right? Come on. Okay. All right. Can you see that okay? All right. So, Graham Allison's Essence of Decision. So the one sentence summary is he's arguing that foreign policy analysts or the mainstream view of them is largely incorrect when they're presuming the rational actor model of states. So he calls this the classical model or actor or model one, and he says instead decisions are the product of organizational behavior or organizational processes, and he calls that model two, and the governmental and bureaucratic politics model, which is model three. So he asserts that if analysts account for the organizational behavior and bureaucratic governmental politics or the political process present in other states, they will be able to improve their own decision making and be able to predict the behavior of other states more accurately. So as far as a paradigm, I wasn't really sure where to put him. I can tell you what he's against. So I'd say he's probably a processualist or a behavioralist in as much as he's like talking about organizational behavior, or perhaps even an institutionalist, like in regards to the interaction of bureaucratic agencies and stuff. At the very least, you can say that he's obviously arguing against rationalists and also anti-structural realism, since he's opening the black box. And then, not necessarily important to the paradigm, but his book's The Origin of Where We Get That Phrase, where you stand is where you sit. So looking at like your position on something is going to be informed by the incentives of your job. So his thesis, analysts of foreign policy fall prey to a faulty interpretive bias of presuming that states are single entity rational actors, so like they're persons essentially, when the reality is, he would say, that state decisions are generated from complex organizational processes and behaviors and government/bureaucratic politics. The book seeks to elucidate these reformed models of decision-making, which account for these factors, using the Cuban Missile Crisis as a case study. So what broad questions is he trying to answer? So he's trying to say, in order to answer the elusive questions of why the Cuban Missile Crisis happened, so that's the first question. The second question is why the U.S. responded with a naval quarantine. Third question is why the Soviets withdrew the missiles. And fourth, what are the upshots of these phenomena for foreign policy analysts and decision makers? So my in-depth summary kind of revolves around each of the models, but basically he flip-flops like between like giving like a historical, like explaining the theory and then giving the case study, and then just does that 3 times over. So in addition to arguing against model 1 and 4 models 2 and 3, he also wants to parse out if there's common ground between the two camps of foreign policy analysts, which he calls artists and scientists. And he's trying to kind of amalgamate them together in one theory that revolves around, they both have this mutual desire to explain phenomena. So what are scientists and artists? So scientists believe that artists lack the pattern recognition component of analysis to be valid. So they're more big picture, systematize everything. And then the artists are the other way, inverse. They believe that the scientific approach is too rigid and isn't permissive enough of ascribing important weight to key details. So they are very much fine grain, not so systematic. Allison's approach attempts to integrate these camps' respective emphases on personality and process. He claims that common ground between them is the desire to explain events. Allison's explanation for why the Cuban Missile Crisis occurred is largely due to the fact that Soviet air defenses, so the BVO, was structurally isolated from the Soviet leadership and from the scientists. This resulted in the limited inputs of those two bodies into the BVO's decision-making, leading it to act upon its own self-maximalizing incentive structures over and against the policy desired by the Soviet leadership, which was détente. So getting into the models, Model 1, the rational actor, states that states are akin to rational individuals in their decision-making. They establish their aims, make cost-benefit analyses, and set tactics and strategy accordingly. Mistakes or miscalculations are due to imperfect information. And Allison challenges this notion by contending that governments are an amalgamation of many bodies with varying incentives and interests. So this is kind of to say, like, he's saying that it's not the Soviet Union's position is X, so he's saying that's not actually true. So Model 2 is the organizational process or the organizational behavior model. So this model examines the standard operating procedures of the different bodies of government. The product of their interaction then translates into state policy. In particular, decisions that may appear irrational when bloated entities, so like bloated in the bureaucratic sense, operate on entrenched standard operating procedures. So this is the way things are done. Since they deal with the same limited set of problems, they don't adapt well to new problems and new situations. So finally, the third model is the bureaucratic politics model. This is where different bureaucratic organizations with competing incentives, so each bureaucracy's got its own incentives of perpetuating its own process, expanding its mission, and accruing more resources and funding to itself. So these various bureaucratic agencies and institutions compete against each other, and this is what he calls the bureaucratic politics. And this model is most opposed to the rational actor model since it's a house divided against itself. So to kind of put this into the context of the Cuban Missile Crisis, so in the American context, Model 1 would be something like Secretary McNamara and JFK are in the Oval Office, and they are kind of moving pieces on the board that go where they're told. The second model would be Admiral Anderson, so the head naval officer on the ground is relying on Navy doctrine or the naval standard operating procedures to make decisions. And then the third is similar to the second, but it's more of the naval officer is kind of bucking the other involved parties in making decisions that maximize the Navy's control over the decision-making process or whatever incentives will maximize the Navy's bureaucratic incentives. So to look at it from the Soviet side, again, the BVO was structurally isolated from the Soviet leadership, resulting in limited inputs from the Soviet leadership into the decision-making process, which leads them to act on their own, self-maximizing incentive structures over and against the policy desired by the Soviet leadership. So the Kremlin obviously wants Model 1. They want the appearance of unity and party control. And then the BVO, I would say, are operating on Model 2 and possibly 3. So the BVO's standard operating procedures railroads them into decisions by doctrine, but also possibly by their own bureaucratic incentives of accruing more importance and therefore more resources. So kind of some concluding thoughts. The book doesn't really have a single overarching historical narrative. It kind of just like jumps piecemeal into like examining the Cuban Missile Crisis through each phenomenon, but it never really asserts like what really happened, as far as I could tell. And a lot of the critics of this book make their criticisms along similar lines. And then as far as like, putting this book in conversation with like rationalists or structural realists, I'm not really convinced that when it came down to the wire, that necessity wouldn't overcome some of these organizational or bureaucratic politics obstacles to the unitary state. Like, if I think if the party leadership is thrown and the state is thrown into a existential event there's going to be less resistance to doing what's needed to get the state out of that, or get the state out of that situation. So I think, like, maybe when the stakes are lower, there's a bit more autonomy and a bit more freedom for sort of disagreements along the lines of the second and third model in the decision making process. But I think that once the stakes get higher, and like when they get all the way up to like an existential crisis, the necessity that the existential threat imposes will, I think, allow the first model to win out. But I feel relatively confident about this. It's really just you need to know the three models.
Yeah, and I know, like, I think Campbell really likes this book.
Mm-hmm.
But I think knowing those models, because I think um, I gave a lecture on this book for his Causes of War class, and he
Yeah.
was like, you must emphasize the where you stand is where you sit.
Yeah.
It's like, I
Yeah.
want that quotation in the PowerPoint. So I think if
Yeah.
you were to throw that in there in any response, he'd just eat it up.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's just mainly like looking at the competing incentives. But I don't know. I mean, I can kind of understand um the whole thing with the BBO. I don't know. But like, do you see what I'm saying with like in a I just think that there would be less resistance to
Yeah.
the state if there's an existential crisis, you know?
Yeah. I mean, I think what Allison would say is that, like, oh, I'm using the case study of the Cuban Missile Crisis because this should be the biggest existential threat. So if
Yeah.
it still holds even in like the most existential of existential threats, doesn't that mean something? But I kind of see,
Mhm.
like, I mean, I'm a structures guy myself,
Yeah.
and a defensive realist, so I'm not entirely convinced by his argument too, or at least
Hmm.
as a social science, piece, it's not that
Hmm.
um, yeah, not that convincing because it has no real explanatory value.
Right. And he like at one point even says that he's like, my models aren't going to, I'm not saying that they explain everything. And I think at one point he says like they may not even explain anything. I'm just trying to get us to think in other terms than the rational
Yeah.
model. And I'm, well, then that kind of like you're shooting yourself in the foot there, aren't you? Like,
Yeah.
all right.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I mean, the takeaway that I thought was, when the stakes are lower, there might be more freedom
Yeah.
and less momentum from the powers that be, like at the very top, to permit these kind of freedoms. But when I think it comes down to the wire, everybody's incentives will kind of be overridden by this overarching singular incentive of trying to preserve the state or something in the face of nuclear annihilation or whatever.
Yeah.
That's an incentive that's going to trump every other incentive. So,
Yeah, and I think some of the realists in the 90s and 2000s, I think maybe it was Walt, it might have been Mearsheimer, but it might have been Walt.
yeah.
It was like the big issue, like the U.S. is going to make a ton of mistakes because it's the only great power.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
so that means that it's allowed to make mistakes in a way that other great
Yeah. Yeah.
powers, that when there are other great powers, you can't make those
The
mistakes.
stakes are low and there's no real consequence, so they can afford to make those mistakes.
Yeah, yeah, and so
Yeah,
then you
that
you
makes
get
sense.
yeah, so you get like the unipolar moment actually increasing the
Yeah.
chances of war.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
like smaller wars, but still like
Yeah. 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 No, on its face, I think that sounds right.
yeah.
Okay. Cool. All right. Do you want me to do Went and Shelling now or after you do yours?
Let me do mine,
Okay.
and then maybe we start a new stream for the wind
Okay.
chilling because I think I
That
gave
sounds
this
good.
one Gaddis, and that way
Yeah,
we
that's
can,
good.
just in case they guys come, Windows
Hmm.
containment. Okay, you can see that okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So this one, U.S. did not have a coherent grand strategy that took them from the start of the Cold War through 1992. But there was but individual presidents did have strategies that basically alternated between a symmetrical and asymmetrical approach. So that's what Gaddis is saying happens. So no coherent specific grand strategy to say in 40 years the Soviet Union will collapse. We did not have that, but we did have individual presidents with a grand strategy, with their own grand strategies. For paradigm, not really, more of a history. The thesis is that U.S. presidents alternated between a symmetrical and asymmetrical approach throughout the Cold War. And the broad question here really is, did the U.S. have a coherent grand strategy during the Cold War? It's a kind of a historical approach. So he goes through each president and kind of describes the key decision makers in that president's grand strategy. So he begins with the prologue. This is containment before Kennan. Kennan, we'll get into in chapter 2, but before Kennan, Truman adopted a quid pro quo strategy. So trying to be like to the Soviets, you do good things, I'll give you carrots. You do bad things, I'll hit you with a stick. But as long as you're doing good things, then we're good. We're good to go. But Gaddis says that failed because the sticks were unimpressive. The Soviets at this point had a larger military, and the U.S. nuclear superiority didn't have any real threat against like Moscow because we didn't have the range in order to bomb it. And the carrot economic assistance was not valuable enough to justify any concessions. So Kennan, at this point, is working in the Moscow embassy. And this was at the time when the State Department was a good institution that actually kept people in one place for a long time. And so Kennan had spent a lot of time in Moscow, and had looked at like the Soviet people and had thought that a new grand strategy was required. So he writes the long telegram, is what it's called, to Washington, D.C., outlining a new strategy of particularism. So he thought that instead of trying to contain the Soviets on all fronts, we should have a focused strategy on the key centers of industrial and military power in the world, which he said were the US, UK, Germany, USSR, and Japan. So he says the objective of containment was to limit the Soviet expansion into those key areas. And he says, actually, he was fairly non-ideological. He says communism was only really a threat in that it was what facilitated Soviet expansion. And so the objective of containment was to limit Soviet expansion, not to limit communist expansion. So strategy is restore balance of power in Europe, limit Soviet influence abroad, and slowly change the Soviet view of international relations to be from one of adversarialness with the U.S. to one of kind of at least a détente type thing. Chapter 3, implementing containment. So here Kennan, or Truman, starts kind of adopting this Kennan approach. So building up the international order in these independent centers of power. However, Truman ultimately tasked this guy, Paul Nitze, who was in the State Department in D.C., to outline, or in the National Security Council, in D.C., to outline a comprehensive kind of strategy. So Kennan said, we don't need a comprehensive strategy. We just need to, start building this up. And Truman tasked Nitze to make that comprehensive strategy instead. And what came from that was NSC 68, which said that there was no communist expansion allowed. So the Soviets were not allowed to expand anywhere. And this directly preceded and was the cause of the Korean War. So Kennan would have said, Korea doesn't really matter. It's not a center of industry. We don't need to defend it. But NSC 68 said we did. So that's where we get into Chapter 4, NSC 68 and the Korean War. So the North Koreans invade South Korea, and we respond with as much force as we have available. And for the purposes of this, we have NSC 68 saying that we actually need like a perimeter defense in like Lutvakian terms. So we need to totally surround the Soviets. Chapter 5, we get into Eisenhower. So this was a symmetrical. NSC 68 was a symmetrical response. So by that, symmetrical versus asymmetrical is not about the response itself, but about the amount of force that we put on that response. So asymmetrical is we attack with like everything we have with the smallest provocation. Symmetrical response is we match like for like. So we get into chapter 5, Eisenhower, Dulles, and the new look. So Eisenhower actually did not disagree with Truman too much, but was put under pressure to distance himself from Truman because of political reasons. So he appointed Dulles, John Foster Dulles, who is a Republican strategist. So Dulles was nervous at the high cost of containment and hated ideas of isolationism, which he felt that Kennan was kind of going a little bit too far towards. The book Gaddis says that Dulles primarily determined the nature of strategy, but Eisenhower had a keener sense of strategy. Let's see, Dulles was also concerned with a moral bankruptcy. That's why he was against isolationism. He believed that the U.S. had to be a positive presence abroad as kind of like a moral duty that we have. But Eisenhower was more Clausewitzian. He was, deliberately Clausewitzian. He had read Clausewitz in the 1920s, and his superior had made him read it, and he had adopted that strategy. So Eisenhower believed wholeheartedly that means should be subordinate to ends, and that effort expended without purpose served no purpose. So in other words, the Cold War had to have an objective other than just victory. So we can't just be like, the only strategy in the Cold War is to beat the Soviets, because that's something that's a means to an end. It's not an end of itself. And then he said that democracy must be upheld in the U.S. So any restriction on freedom of people's way of life or too much security in the U.S. was bad. So he adopted a asymmetric strategy through massive nuclear deterrence. So any sort of Soviet push into that threatened the U.S., the new look under Eisenhower was to have a massive retaliation. So we're symmetrical, now we're asymmetrical. Chapter 6, implementing new look, difficult to tell. Gaddis says on one hand, there wasn't a huge spread in communism. He's like, yeah, the Vietnamese, North Vietnam existed, but in Cuba, but who really cares? But on the other hand, people in Eisenhower's time hated it because it relied excessively on nuclear weapons. And they felt that he had fumbled the handling of third world revolutions, like in Cuba, allowed a missile gap to develop, and neglected opportunities for negotiations with the USSR. That fourth one, those all were actually Kennedy's main criticism with Eisenhower. But the missile gap became a huge part of Kennedy's campaign. Chapter 7, Kennedy-Johnson flexible response. Kennedy thought that the NSC under Eisenhower had grown too bloated, so cut it back. His strategy was to go back to a symmetrical response, which he called flexible response. So on this one, the flexibility is not to figure out when and where to apply, but to have the flexibility to push back against the Soviets on all fronts. So conventional military, nuclear weapons, economic, guerrilla war, all of that stuff. We had to have the capability to do that. Chapter 8, so implementing flexible response, Vietnam is a test case. Gaddis says we should use Vietnam as a test case, and it shows that flexible response doesn't work. And I just pulled that quote directly. Rarely have accomplishments turned out so totally at variance with intended objectives. The war did not save South Vietnam. It did not deter future aggression. It did not enhance the credibility of U.S. commitments elsewhere. It did not prevent recriminations at home. And Gaddis says it's not even Johnson's fault, since Johnson followed Kennedy's strategy probably more than Kennedy would have followed Kennedy's strategy. um, and he says that the defeat in Vietnam does happen if you follow flexible responses strategy logically. Like if you follow it logically, there will be a defeat in South Vietnam. Um, and he says, Gaddis says, flexible response was at its heart a fascination with means at the expense of ends. So if we can just figure out the right means, then we don't even need to worry about the ends. Chapter 9, Nixon, Kissinger, and détente. Nixon wanted to lessen the tensions with the Soviets, combine the tactical flexibility of Kennedy-Johnson system with the structure of Eisenhower. Lessening of tensions was meant almost solely to convince the Soviets to self-contain. That was Kissinger's goal. And the real genius of Kissinger was using tactical escalation to cover up strategic withdrawal. So we could pull back in certain areas, but not seem weak, like we were losing things, by tactically escalating in other areas. And this was a asymmetric strategy. So we've transitioned. Kennedy was symmetrical. Now we're back to asymmetrical. Chapter 10, implementing détente, largely succeeded, but Congress, bureaucracy, and other people didn't like it very much. Chapter 11, Reagan, Gorbachev, and the completion of containment. Gaddis almost completely skips over Carter. He says Carter didn't add a new strategy, and the Soviets thought he had no strategy at all because he had contradictory policies. But he says Reagan relied on instincts more than systematic study. There's an extended bit about how great Reagan is, that he was like straightforward, pretended to be dumb while pushing Soviets to the breaking point. And the big thing that he tried to introduce is the SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative, also known as Star Wars. He said this violated the principle of mutually assured destruction and freaked everyone out. But he says that we also need to give some credit to Gorbachev, because Gorbachev thought the Soviet Union was falling, and was looking for a way to have an off-ramp. And so, yeah, Gorbachev should receive a lot of credit for his handling of the end of the Soviets in the Cold War too. And then chapter 12, epilogue. I think is containment after the Cold War. I said, doesn't really matter. Something about how much foresight Kennan had, and maybe the prospects for human liberty have increased. But I think it's ultimately an unimportant section of the book. Gave it that confidence level of 7. Although now I'm going through it, I might bump it up to an 8 because I remembered way more than I thought I did. That's strategies of containment.
Cool. Yeah. So it just seems like the main things to get out of that is that there's no overarching coherent strategy over the course of the whole Cold War, but that presidents come up with their own, and that they go back and forth between the symmetrical and asymmetrical.
Yeah.
So
and Gaddis seems to be most impressed with presidents that subordinated the means to the ends. So I'll actually add that.
So that would be.
I'd be
Eisenhower,
and Reagan.
Maybe Nixon or Reagan.
Yeah, okay. and Nixon. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Cool. And then so the long telegram is strong point defense. I know Jordan makes a big deal out of this in Grand Strategy, that he wants you to know that the long telegram argues for strong point defense.
Yeah.
And then we get that shift in NSC 68 to the perimeter defense, and it's no longer about Soviet, but about communism more broadly.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So does Truman just kind of get because the way that I thought it was it kind of proceeds in 5 stages between from Kennan to Kissinger.
Yeah.
So is Truman kind of like a stage 0 almost? Like he's before this process really begins, or sort of? Okay.
Yeah. So what happens? I forget exactly which year. I think Kennan wrote the long telegram in 1949.
Yeah, that sounds
Um,
right.
so that prologue is like talking about that like 1945 to 1949.
Yeah, yeah.
And at that point, the U.S. Thought that it would be 10 to 15 years before the Soviets could get a nuclear bomb. Ended
Uh-huh.
up being 2 years. From like in
Yeah.
45, they were like it'll be 15 years or so, but ended up being 2 years. So it went from us in this containment before Kennan saying
Hmm.
like the Soviets can beat us in a war, conventional war, but we can always nuke them, and we have that over them, and we can be assured of this for a while. Uh, and then when the Soviets tested their bomb in like 1947 or 48, it was just
Hmm.
we just lost it.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so Kennan comes out and is like, we can no longer rely on just threatening the Soviets with nuclear weapons, and
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
Soviets have such a larger military than us that if we don't concentrate, um, they can defeat us. If we try to just surround the Soviet Union
Hmm.
with our military,
Wasn't it like right after World War II, like
yeah,
the Soviets had it's like 400 divisions in Eastern Europe or something crazy like that,
yeah,
and it was like four times as much as the Allies.
mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
crazy.
yeah.
So so the long telegram strong point is that asymmetrical or symmetrical?
That is asymmetrical.
Okay, that's what I figured. And
Yep,
then NSC 68 is symmetrical.
yep,
Eisenhower's new look is asymmetrical.
yep.
Flexible response is symmetrical then, if it's like
Yeah,
means to means. Okay.
yeah,
And then detente is asymmetrical.
yeah,
Okay, cool.
yeah,
And then Reagan's also, I guess, asymmetrical since Star Wars is breaking the rules.
yeah,
Okay, cool.
yeah. And
All
then
right. Yeah.
and then Carter is in there just kind of having nothing. Yeah,
Yeah. Oof.
yeah.
Okay. Uh yeah, cool.
Cool. Stop this.